Well, this morning I'm going to start on the first of the paintings of the series in this new visit here across to America, into North Carolina. There's some beautiful azaleas and flowers out. I want to do a painting for my friend Jack, who's coming to see me today and tomorrow. They got married not long ago, and I'd like to give them a small present. So I'll have a go with pastels at this. Now with the brushes, we've got brushes for all occasions here, the oval mops, the nylon flats which are a little bit stiffer for more dry brush work, the hakes, rounds, riggers and swords, very useful. And more recently a new one to my armoury is this rather interesting little brush here which has all these bristles cut away, which would be ideal for doing grass work or textures. You can get a similar effect with the hakes when they're dry, but this is a bit more even, so it could be of use in the future. In this case I'll be using mainly cobalt violet, some of the cobalt blue I suspect, and into the yellows and greens. Chances are that on these lighter areas such as the stamens and around here I'm going to need a little bit of masking fluid as well, so I'll draw this out quickly firstly and add some of these light areas of the masking fluid to be picked up later. I'm going to do a traditional watercolour. I'm going to do these azalea flowers, and I've got to put masking fluid on these areas next, as I've now done the drawing. So these stamens and some of the light areas, I'm going to let that dry overnight, and tomorrow we'll get down to doing a traditional watercolour of washes and glazes. Right, you can see the masking fluid is now on these grey areas, so I know where I'm going. Once that's dry we'll start the painting. Well, the masking fluid is now dried, so we can make a start on the first washes, which will be slightly variegated, and then into the glazing over those, and we're going to work on the flower petals and gradually outwards to finish with the leaves, and probably give a slight vignette at the sides. So if we want to work our way downwards so our hand isn't touching the work, let's look at these petals first. And on my palette the colours I'm going to be using most are this cobalt violet, possibly then into a little bit of the purple, and we're going to be coming round to some of the alizarin crimson, I think, and rose into that. So I've made a start here, and what I'm doing is laying on the cobalt violet thinly, and then a little bit more while it's wet, a little bit more thicker pigment of the same colour into there, and then here I've dropped in some little bit of purple. Now if we drop the wet into the wet, we've got to be very careful. It's called controlled accident, as we drop one colour into another, so how far it'll spread. If we put this in when it's too wet, or we put too much water on with our paint, it'll spread too far. If we put wet next to wet, or wet into wet, it'll spread into each other. If we have a dry or hard edge, if we have a dry edge, it'll be a hard edge that we get. So here, you can see I put that in and it's gently blending. Now going back to this, which is still just wet, I'm going to take a little bit of rose, and I'm going to drop that rose into there because we need this pinker colour, ever so softly, just in little dots, so that they spread out gently into the petal. A little bit here, gently into here, tiniest dots, and they'll spread out depending how wet your paper is. Now I can teach anybody to paint and I can show them how to use these various mediums, but actually teaching you how much water you should put into your paint, when you should place it onto the paper, you can see what's happening here. But that isn't easy for me to do for you, because you have to actually learn that. You have to do it to find out. There's a bit of red coming down to there, a bit of softness coming to those petals. And you see here it's a little bit strong, so I'm going to clean my brush, and with a damp brush just take off some of that, just suck it out a fraction and blend it in softly there. Look at the lovely effect we get. So we can blend in on something like that. Now, it still needs more work here. It still has to be a bit darker. So I'm going to put a little bit of Indian red into there. Put a little bit of light red into there, which is like Indian red, it's a sienna. And it also wants to be slightly more purple again, so... And then a wee bit more of that deep purple, just to warm it up a little bit again. It look warmer, just to make it look a bit warmer there and give it more depth. So these are the wet into wet effects. And look at that lovely depth we've got there. I can't do any more with that until it dries off more. Come back into here, and drop in a little bit more of that purple down into there, and a wee touch of that rose, just on the edges. So we're working wet into wet here, where that curls round, a little bit more warmth. We can also suck the paint out. So I'm going to dry my brush off completely, come back in with a dry brush,
and just lift out little areas. You see how those spots are appearing there now as I lift the paint away again. So if you make a mistake, you can always come back and take a little bit out like that. You have the control that way. Now we continue to work over these. This paint here I put on earlier is now dry. Let's have a close-up of that. So, this was a wash. If we put the same colour over again, look what happens. We get a deeper colour of the same. If I put that colour over there, because I'm painting wet onto dry, it gives me a slightly harder edge. So here I'm able to start painting now some more texture into it, because I can actually, it's not spreading out, I can actually paint detail. So we can let the light shine into that. Now whilst that's wet, I can come back and into those wet areas I can then drop wet into wet. So we've got the wet on the dry to give a hard edge, then we've got the wet into the wet to give softer tones. A little bit now of my red, just down into here, my rose just going on down to the edges. Carefully, subtly, just a little bit of wet into wet, just touching into these petals. So you see how we can play the wet into the wet or the wet on the dry, and even back again afterwards, the wet into the wet again. You see a hard edge there? Now if I want to soften that hard edge, so this was wet on dry, I can come back in with some clean water afterwards and blend it in subtly. So here's your effect for painting flowers, flower petals individually. Come onto that one again, thinly, thin coat, a thin wash, all the way down into there. I want to leave a lighter area here, so it comes around that, there like that, and it's a bit deeper next to it. Come in there, a bit like painting by numbers, isn't it? We're painting in one shape next to another, and as I've always said, it's putting the right colours in the right places and the right shapes, relevant one to another, so the cools against the warms. We're still doing our wet into wet, subtle soft effects, dropping some more purple into there, little touches of it, don't want too much of anything, playing very, very gently at the moment with delicate watercolour. Delicate is the word of watercolour, I think. You can go strong and bright, as you've seen me do with that figure painting earlier on at the school. Now this colour here should be fairly dry by now, just test it carefully with your finger, that's right. And we want to start to pick out the individual petals more, so we'll come around that shape there, leaving it sharp edged, just letting it blend in. Same around here. See the sharp edge we get when we paint wet onto dry. That's slightly softer, that one, because it's still a bit damp. More purple. If I feel that purple's too dark, which I think it is, dry my brush again and lift some of that paint out. Suck it away, like that, you see, so it becomes lighter. We've got this constant control. Let's come down to this large central petal here, which is very important, and really work on that one, because that'll give you a much better idea of how it's all done. So again, I'm going to take my cobalt violet and a very thin coat of that first of all, very thin, almost to white here, and let that dry off a bit. That's my wash. Remember, a wash is your first colour, and a glaze is the colour that goes on over the top, which is transparent. Glazes are nearly always transparent, there's not much point in them otherwise. While I'm at it, I'll have a go at this pattern, this flower down here too, that petal there. Now, whilst it's wet, we can tint it, we can go a bit stronger. So whilst it's wet, I can drop in more of that colour here to give that soft, slightly mottled effect of these leaves, just tickling it in like this. And then I want to leave that and come in harder edged afterwards. Whilst they're drying, I'll work on other areas. So as this area dries off a bit, I'm going to come down and drop in colour into these pieces because they are separate. Now, where I've got this deep grey colour here is the masking fluid, because that wants to be very bright later against this darker colour. So here we are dropping in that cobalt violet on the surface gently. That's a lot more purple there now, so I'm going to come in with that purple quite strongly here, all over there, and drop that wet into wet throughout here. Same on this petal here, which is totally in shadow. And then into that, start dropping some of the rose, the warmer colour. Don't have too much liquid paint on your brush for this, otherwise it'll just spread too far. Just tinting in a little touch of the colour on the end of your brush. Don't overdo it. And so we can bring that up softly. These lovely wet into wet soft effects. Slight striation in the petal there, so I'm going to deliberately bring those little strokes across. And they'll blend together a bit afterwards. That lovely effect we can get with that purple and the rose there. And we come across to this area here. We're just going to put in these glazes over the washes. So this is now dry. If I bring it over that, you see the sharper edge we get, because I want these dark lines of purple coming down into here and underneath here to show the shadow. Into that I can drop it even a bit darker, so I can go quite dark, dropping the wet now into the wet where I've already painted, like that. The same under here, I can go a bit darker again with this purple. I can make it darker around these stamens to make them show out more as well. As I've got masking fluid in there, it won't matter because it'll resist it nicely. Like that. So one little darker mark coming over here as well, just a bit of shadow there. This area should be dry enough to work on now. We've done our soft wet into wets. Now I want to give it a glazing, slightly warmer, so a mixture of the purple and the rose. Drop into that, it's still a little bit damp, but I should get a slightly more controlled edge. And then again, very thin wash over here while I'm at it. Even thinner than that, much, much lighter. So I'm leaving that bit there, because that bit there wants to be on its own quite separate, doesn't want to blend and merge in. Right. Now let's see if we can get dry enough, let's see if we can get a wash to go on there. So if I take this colour here, it should be a hard edge. Here we go, there's our hard edge look. Down for that bit of shadow. A little bit there. This now a glaze over that. Coming into my slightly more purple colour here. So it's just on the verge of being soft and hard there. Can we drop in any more over here? It wants a little more dark there. Coming around these stamens into here. Right down into that bit. Very soft, very subtle, very light. And a bit more purple down into there. Now we've got to let those dry again. How's this doing over here? Is it ready for it yet? Still a bit wet yet. I want to lift a little bit out of there. I want a bit lighter across here. So I'm going to take my brush, clean brush, just lift out some of the colour there to make it slightly whiter. See, quite dark in places. Still waiting for it to dry a bit more at the moment. Now where that's very dark there, I'm going to add a little bit of Prussian blue to here, which will be much darker. See how deep that makes things. Some colours are more transparent than others, so some are much better colours for glazing with. So this is traditional watercolour, very delicately working things up using our very thin washes and glazes first, keeping things fairly separate. Textures there, just a bit of dry brush work over the top. That's green there, that leaf. Under here is a bit darker, so we'll take some red and purple and just get a bit darker with our edge under there to bring that out a bit more red. And it comes purple around that edge. It gets quite hard to see wood for trees. It gets quite hard to see which bit of which. It's a very complicated piece of painting. And then back to that red I was using earlier, the light red, was like the Indian red, to give a bit more depth and warmth right down into here, that dark petal behind, and the same in here I think. And still just dropping colours one into another as they're still damp to get our lovely feeling of shade and light and dark amongst these petals. That's drier there now, so I can tickle in a bit more carefully, a bit more red. Let's see if this is now dry enough to take that glaze. Still a little bit wet, but it's just allowing me to have a slightly harder edge, which is what I was after. Down like that. Same here. Darker edge this side. Stronger around there, a lot stronger down into here. Up around that petal edge. There. And a dark area that side of that. And this is also quite dark, but I want to go considerably darker. And this gives us that effect of the leaf curling round. So, washing it gently on to make a glaze. Of the rose, because we have that lovely texturing happening there. So I'm going to go quite dark into, and you see how that now spreads out where it's still wet, and where it's dry it stays still. So I'm going to do a little bit of this while it's wet, and then come back in when it's completely dry and do the rest of these little dots. Okay, what I'm going to do now, whilst these flowers are drying off a bit before I can put on those final sharper glazes, is to start to look at the various greens. And we've got some lovely blue greens, yellow greens, all sorts of things going on here. And then I'll do a dark wash coming in around the outside afterwards. First of all then, let's look at the yellowy green. That's these ones here. I'm going to take some aureolin yellow and just drop that in. A lovely transparent yellow, the aureolin yellow. Very much you want to play these cool and warm greens now. So if I put some cerulean blue now next to it there, and then start to blend that into the yellow, you get that effect of sunlight, and that goes to a much warmer green. Take a bit of sap green, which is a much browner green. So I'll add some gold into that. We get this lovely warm sap green effect coming into there. That same colours coming on down here. So leaf by leaf. And there's the reflected light of the flowers coming on down there, so into that leaf there's going to be a bit of that pink coming. Then into the cerulean blue at the side. Really look for these colours. Quincadrone Gold, quite an interesting colour this one. Slightly ochre-y colour. Come back to the darks afterwards. Get all your lights in first. That's watercolour for you. Playing the difference between our gold and cooler yellows. The Aureolins are very cool lemony yellow. I prefer Aureolin to the lemon yellow actually. There, I can now put the Aureolin in, and I'll take in my cerulean quite strongly after that. Not that strongly. And blend it in with the yellow to give myself a green. So I'm marking time at the moment. I'm waiting for this other paint to dry on the flowers, and whilst that's doing so, getting in these light greens, washes over here, and then a bit of the purple and the green together. Sap green will give us this lovely dark. I'll just bring those striations of leaves through there to give the effect of the leaves. Right, dark down against that petal. Soften that, blend it right back, because I want dark to go over that later. I'm just letting some indications of green show in here, because I know later on I'm going to need them. Delicately just placing these colours, hopefully correctly, one to another. And letting the controlled accident do the work for me. When I get the darks in a moment, I think this will make more sense. Now some ultramarine and a little burnt sienna should start to give me some nice warm darks into here. Around my flower shapes. And again, we'll let a lot of that happen with controlled accident. Sometimes I want it a bit bluer, sometimes I want it a bit browner. Here I want a bit more blue in the colours. Just indicating things. Don't get carried away with trying to put too much detail. Let the viewer's eye do the job as well. You can see now the darks are starting to work against the lights. So we've got light against dark, cool against warm, as I was saying before. I'm going to come back into those flowers still. I haven't forgotten about them. I'm just playing with these darks at the moment. All these little shapes that are to give us these negative shapes that I'm painting in quite carefully at the moment. I'm going to come back later with some much bigger brushes to work these up. More blue going on down here in that dark. So I'm going to use a bit more cobalt in my darker colour here. And then come into ultramarine more there. And then my browner, darker use of ultramarine and burnt sienna here. And if an edge looks too sharp to you, we'll blend it a bit with a bit of water. Lovely deep ultramarine blue going on underneath in there. Again, back over here we need our lighter blues going on. I've yet to come back into these flowers, so not finished yet by any means. Oh, quick drum gold just there, it's a much warmer colour. And down through here. Keep playing these different colours one to another, don't just do this business I said earlier on of penny a yard. Don't want to be. Still want to be observing all the time. So really got to go quite dark in there. I'm going to add a little bit of Prussian as well to really give me a lovely rich dark in amongst these, especially just here. And finally this vignette of darks around here. So pull it together. Okay, this morning we're going to have a go at painting on some mount card. It's quite nice to paint on with acrylics, and I'm going to do this, or have a go at playing with this limited palette I've got here of colours to try these azaleas. A whole splash of colour here, and treat it again fairly loosely. Now, because the paints have tended to be slightly thinner than the oil paint that I like to use, I feel I've got to paint the light colours first to get the luminosity on this. I'm not going to bother drawing anything out, just going straight in with the colour and try and just enjoy these little... It's very much an impressionist piece anyway. I think it lends itself to it because of all these little flowers. So I suppose I'm almost building it up like a watercolour. Each time you do a painting, there are different pressures on you for different effects, so it forces you, which is nice, to learn new things and paint new ways. So here I'm painting on a very absorbent surface with paint that isn't really that vibrant, to try and get that vibrant quality. So we'll work up these greys and then come back in with very light creams, just a tint off white and whites into these lovely azaleas. The brush strokes are almost petal size as it is. Into that white we can put these blue and pink greys. that as I go on with this, the darks will pull it all together again. We could have kept it very high key. I decided to work right through to these darks into texture, and then to bring some of the lights back on a little bit on top, but to get the feeling of this very, very complicated mass of foliage and textures going on. Bring them out a bit.
Well, that's it. We've come to the end of this 2-week period now. Lovely time. Weather good nearly all of the time. Some storms and a little bit of rain here and there. But in that time I worked inside and did some studio pieces, as you've seen. So I hope you've enjoyed all of these, this series, and can gain from it as much as I've enjoyed and gained from being here.